political correspondent for The Sun, Noah Hoffman. A very good morning to both of you. Nice to see you both.
Yeah,
we are going to kick off with the story dominating the front page, and that was the Pope's funeral yesterday in Rome, as well as what went on just before the service began. So, first of all, the Sunday People here, Legacy of Hope is their headline there, and that extraordinary scene of St. Peter's Square there now.
Yeah, I mean, really striking imagery throughout the whole event, both inside the Vatican walls and outside. And I think, you know, for a lot of people, this was a really, really sad moment. He was remembered by so many, not just Catholics, but members of the wider public as well, as a sort of Pope of the people, you know, someone who genuinely cared about issues that many would say go back to the heart of sort of Catholic values, caring about the poor, caring about the vulnerable. He was considered more of a modern Pope than the previous ones. And I think the imagery and the crowds we saw really reflected that. But what was perhaps the most interesting was the political element to this all. This was one big diplomatic extravaganza, and the images we saw of world leaders uniting, you know, donned in their black clothes. I think in the Telegraph or in the Times, there was a comparison to sort of like a mob funeral with all these very glamorous world leaders dressed in glamorous, like, black outfits. And some really interesting discussions happening there that we'll go into.
Yeah, and, well, there's the front page of the Telegraph, which we'll come on to in a moment. But really interesting as well, as you say, about how you had 50 world leaders, heads of state, which is extraordinary in itself. But also, Pope Francis wanted many poor people to be there, migrants, prisoners, people who had a struggle in life, and the address referred to his support for migrants, which would have been quite uncomfortable for some of the leaders sitting there in the front rows.
Yeah, as Noah alluded to, he was a reformist, right? I mean, he represented almost a progressive politics that actually feels a little bit out of kilter with where we are in the world right now. And I think his message would have resonated, given the audience, given the fact that it was first time in quite a while a diplomatic meeting with so many world leaders. You don't get that for any other event quite like this. So it was one of those opportunities to try and emphasise what he saw as the values of the Catholic Church at a time of quite significant turbulence.
That's right. And of course, there's now 9 days of mourning before the conclave meets to select the new Pope. And it'll be interesting to see whether it's a Pope that carries on the legacy of Pope Francis, or whether we get a more conservative Pope coming in. That's obviously a debate to be had further down the line. But let's turn back to the Sunday Telegraph, which we saw briefly there, and that extraordinary photograph, which was released after the service, an image of a meeting that happened before the service got underway inside St. Peter's Basilica. Really extraordinary.
It sounds potentially historic, which is what Zelensky says as well, right? So it basically, Trump and Zelensky met for the first time since that very turbulent White House meeting. And it sounds like Trump is actually somewhat aggrieved by Putin's actions over the last couple of days. It sounds like there could potentially be a turning point with the US relationship with Zelensky, which is obviously quite a light at the end of the tunnel. Given the PM and Macron's attempt to draw that coalition of the willing, they must feel a little bit relieved to see this as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, it is interesting, isn't it? Because Donald Trump tweeted after this conversation or put a post on social media, at least, on Truth Social, saying he was talking about the recent attacks in the last few days by Russia on Ukraine, and says, it makes me think that maybe he doesn't want to stop the war. He's tapping me along and has to be dealt with differently through banking or secondary sanctions. Too many people are dying. And there does definitely appear to be a shift in tone here.
There does, and I mean, it is crazy that it's taken this many deaths and these many missile strikes for Trump to put out this statement saying, oh, maybe Putin doesn't want a ceasefire. I would be hesitant to get too excited about this statement, because Trump changes his opinion on the war in Ukraine so quickly. And we have seen posts on his Truth Social before that, you know, tend to lean to Zelensky's point of view and to the plight of Ukrainians, only then 24 hours or less later for them to lean more towards Putin's direction. But I think the longer this drags out, the more Trump will have just thrown in his face that Putin has no interest in a peace deal. He has no interest in a ceasefire. You can offer him all the concessions in the world, but until he's given Kiev, he's just not going to stop. So, you know, it's a welcome step that Trump is acknowledging this in this tweet, but I would be hesitant to get too excited before he changes his mind again.
Well, yes, and we don't have the details of the peace deal that the US are proposing, although we have got a sense of what it probably looks like, which suggests that that Russia doesn't give up the land that it's already gained so far, something that would be completely unpalatable to the Ukrainian leader. So really interesting to know what they did discuss at that particular meeting and what might have changed Donald Trump's view.
And for Europe, and particularly the UK and France, it's also, we don't yet know sort of what we're defending on the ground, right? So the point of the coalition, the willing, was to enforce that deal. So there's still so many unanswered questions and still a lot of unknown, as you said.
Yeah, so one to be watched, as we have been for many weeks now, and but just the change in body language there compared to the last time they met in the White House, and that incredibly combative, explosive meeting, and the finger pointing looks very different there. And what an extraordinary setting for that meeting. Let's move on, shall we, to the Telegraph, Noah. Take us to an article here which looks ahead to the big battleground ahead, the local elections coming up on Thursday. And a story here about a Tory donor giving his money to Reform.
Yeah, so we've seen quite a few moves, not just from whether it's local politicians, but also the big bankrollers away from the Tories and towards Reform. I think for many of them, they will see that Nigel Farage is just willing to go that step further than Kemi Badenoch and make bigger promises than her. Not that she's been making many at all, because she refuses to put out a full set of policies.
She says she needs to take time
she
to
needs to take her
and
time.
doesn't want to rush.
And whether that strategy pays off remains to be seen. But I think the big money donors are impressed with what Nigel Farage is telling them. There's a lot of anger in the sort of ultra wealthy class over non-doms, over Labour's private school VAT. And I think they're seeing what Nigel's saying and they like it, whether that's on immigration or whether that's on net zero, his pledge to scrap net zero altogether. And they also will be looking at the polls. And I think Reform is now experiencing a momentum that perhaps none of Nigel Farage's former outfits have really experienced in the same way, because with his previous parties, whether it's UKIP or the Brexit Party, they were one-issue parties. So they had these surges of momentum, but then when that issue was a bit more put to bed, they plateaued, whereas Reform is trying to be much more of an all-encompassing political outfit. And I think a lot of these big donors are seeing that and thinking there's no return for the Tories. They perhaps don't like Kemi Badenoch, and they're going to invest in a future right-wing with Farage at the head.
Well, yeah, and really interesting to see whether Reform can translate votes into seats, and also what the Tory attitude towards Reform might be if they do incredibly badly, if the Tories do very badly, come the local elections. Because already we've had Robert Jenrick putting out the idea of maybe some kind of future cooperation, or certainly some kind of united front looking further down the line. Do you think that conversation will be had in Tory circles?
I think it's fascinating, isn't it? Because to your point, that Reform's having to build out a policy platform the way that it's never built out before. It's always been a single-issue party, whether that's Brexit, whether that's immigration. It's felt like this is sort of a precipice where it's trying to be serious. And what's interesting about this particular story, and to the point about Tory collaboration, is to one side of the country, they're talking to the working classes, they're talking about, you know, the down and out, the immigration, and then they're talking to donors about sort of non-doms and inheritance tax. Whether they can keep that balance going and whether it looks slightly disingenuous to voters remains to be seen. But I imagine to a few Tory backbenchers, this feels like fantastic, and it feels quite tantalising, actually.
Yeah, well, very interesting to see which way that goes. And we're sticking with politics a bit further, aren't we, Jade? Because there's a story inside The Observer that's taken your interest.
Yes, yes. So this is obviously polling that's all over the place, really. So obviously Reform are doing very well in quite a few places, but this one in particular is basically explaining how this local elections feels like almost a third-party sort of moment where everyone's kind of just a bit annoyed at mainstream politics and they're looking to find an avenue to express that radicalism.
Well, yeah, so Labour and the Tories could both suffer come these local elections. We'll wait and see. We'll have full coverage on Sky News, of course, through the night, on Thursday night and into the next day as well, because some of the results come quite late in the day. Let's move on, though, to a different issue, Noah. This is in The Sun, and this is the fallout from the Supreme Court's definition of a woman under the equality law.
Yes, so we've got the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, pledging to have some clear and clarifying, that keyword again around this issue, rules for the NHS in the next few weeks. I mean, this entire policy on where trans people should go in various different settings and institutions has been such a mess. It is just about time that there is clear, distinct guidelines that any institution or business can see and follow, and then the issue can be put to bed. But even after the Supreme Court ruling, that was sort of just the beginning, because how it's applied is such a huge question that's led to so much confusion and so much distrust for everyone involved in the debate, regardless of where they are. So I think it will be very welcome that these guidelines are here. I think a lot of women were very uncomfortable with the NHS's current position, and so any clarity around the sort of protection of single sex spaces for a lot of women will be very welcome.
Well, yeah, and a lot of people did welcome the clarity that the verdict, certainly politicians said, well, at least we have a clear kind of verdict here, but it doesn't seem to be entirely clear how that should be applied in all cases. Is that right? Or?
It's slightly ironic that this comes with some clarity, but then it creates new questions, such as trans men using spaces and whether it's appropriate for trans men to use women's spaces. So it created a conversation rather than ended one, and it remains to be seen sort of what the guidelines actually are.
Yeah, indeed. We'll no doubt find out about that soon, because Wes Streeting is talking about weeks away, isn't he, in terms of new guidelines. We are going to talk about Harry Potter now.
Yes, yes.
So this is in the Express. Who's telling me about this? Jay?
Yes,
you pick this one out.
It's a light-hearted one. Essentially, so they obviously bring in Harry Potter to the TV screen. So each movie will become a season, so it's quite a significant extension of the franchise. And this talks about the potential for it to bring a lot of new money into the UK, alongside, say, the Universal Studios, which was recently announced as well. It shows that sort of pull that the soft power of British cultural exports still has, and the potential for it to continue to boost the economy. And I'm sure the government would be quite content with these new announcements coming, and the fact that this could potentially be quite a huge boost for the creative industry.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. We haven't got time. I don't know if you're a Harry Potter fan as well?
Massive fan.
We'll have to talk about it again next hour then. I will see you then. Thanks both very much.
Thank you.